There was a young man who had never seen suffering, not because suffering did not exist, it existed everywhere as it always has, but because his father, a king in what is now southern Nepal, had built a world around him specifically designed to keep it out. No sick people, no old people, no funerals, no poverty visible from the palace walls, everything beautiful, everything comfortable, everything curated to produce a prince who would grow up to rule an empire without ever asking the wrong questions. His name was Siddhartha, and one day, when he was 29 years old, he drove his chariot outside the palace gates. He saw an old man, bent, trembling, barely able to walk. He asked his driver, "What is wrong with that person?" His driver said, "That is old age. That happens to everyone." He saw a man covered in sores, feverish, lying in the road. He asked, "What is that?" His driver said, "That is sickness. That can happen to anyone." He saw a group of men carrying a body. He asked, "What are they carrying?" His driver said, "A dead man. That will happen to all of us." 3 images. One afternoon, and Siddhartha went back to his palace and could not eat. That night he left. He left his wife, his newborn son, his kingdom, and everything his father had built to protect him. He walked into the forest and spent 6 years looking for the answer to the question those 3 images had planted in him. Not the question of who God is, not the question of where the universe came from, the question of why a human being born without asking to be born, given a life they did not request, is required to grow old, get sick and die, and whether there is any way out. This is not a video about which religion is right. This is not a video about converting anyone or defending anyone. This is a video about why one of the deepest thinkers in human history, when asked directly about God, chose silence. And what that silence actually means when you sit with it long enough to hear what it is saying. Because the Buddha was asked about God, directly, by his own monks, repeatedly, and his answer every single time was not a denial. It was not a philosophical argument. It was something more interesting than either of those things. We will get to what it was. But first, the question he was actually trying to answer. Stay with me. There is a story in the Buddhist scriptures called the parable of the poisoned arrow, and it is the clearest window into the Buddhist mind that I know of. A monk named Malankiyaputta came to the Buddha with a list of demands. He wanted answers to the 10 great metaphysical questions. Is the universe eternal or not? Is it finite or infinite? Is the soul the same as the body or different? Does the enlightened one exist after death or not? And then, the one that matters for everything we are talking about today, is there a God who created all of this? He told the Buddha, "If you do not answer these questions, I will leave the community." The Buddha looked at him and told him a story. A man has been shot by a poisoned arrow. He is dying. A doctor comes to remove the arrow, but the man says, "Wait, I will not let you remove this arrow until I know who shot it. What caste were they? What did they look like? Was the bow made of wood or horn? Was the bowstring made of fiber or sinew? Was the arrow shaft made of reed or cane? Was the fletching made of eagle feathers or peacock feathers?" The Buddha paused. "That man," he said, "will die before he gets his answers." And then he said this, "I did not come to tell you whether the universe is eternal. I did not come to explain the nature of the soul. I came because there is an arrow in you, and the arrow is suffering, and I know how to remove it. Everything else," he called it avyakata, the undeclared, the unanswered, "is not something I will address. Not because the questions are unimportant, because they do not help remove the arrow." Here's what most people miss when they hear this story. The Buddha was not an atheist. He never said God does not exist. He never constructed a philosophical argument against the existence of a creator. What he did was something more radical. He set the question aside entirely. He treated it as the wrong question to ask when a person is dying from a poisoned arrow. And then he offered a diagnosis of the human problem that does not require God to be true or false. The first noble truth is dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but the Pali word is more precise than that. Its root image is a wheel whose axle hole is slightly off-center, not broken, not destroyed, just slightly, persistently, inevitably off. The ride is never quite smooth, the satisfaction never quite complete. You get what you wanted, and it is not quite what you thought it would be. You are happy, and then the happiness shifts. You love someone, and the love is always mixed with the fear of losing them. That, the Buddha said, is the fundamental texture of conditioned existence. Not catastrophic, not always painful, just never quite right. But it gets stranger, because the second diagnosis goes deeper. The teaching of anatta, non-self. The claim that what you call I is not a permanent, unchanging thing. It is a process. A river, not a rock. 5 aggregates constantly arising and passing away: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, consciousness, with no fixed core underneath them. What you think of as the self is more like a flame than a stone. It looks stable. It is actually a continuous event. And here is why this matters for the God question. If there is no permanent self, no unchanging soul, then there is no one for God to create, no one for God to love, no one to be saved. The entire Christian framework, a personal God who creates personal souls and enters into personal relationship with them, requires a kind of self that Buddhism says does not exist in the way we think it does. This is not a failure of Buddhist thinking. It is a different starting point, a different diagnosis, a different answer to the question of what exactly is wrong with the human condition. You are starting to see why this is not a simple disagreement. The Buddha diagnosed the problem and offered a path. The Christian tradition diagnosed the problem and offered a person. Both took human suffering with complete seriousness. Both produced people of extraordinary compassion and depth, but they began in different places, and that beginning shapes everything that follows. If this is landing for you, subscribe, because what comes next is where the two paths come surprisingly close to each other, and then diverge at exactly one point, and that one point is everything. Here is where it gets genuinely surprising. The Buddhist concept of nirvana, the goal, the destination, the thing the practice is aimed at, is one of the most difficult concepts in any religious tradition to describe. And the reason it is difficult is not because it is vague. It is because the Buddha deliberately refused to describe it in positive terms. He said, nirvana is not existence. It is not non-existence. It is not both. It is not neither. It is unconditioned. It is the cessation of craving, aversion, and delusion. It is the blowing out of the fires that keep the wheel of suffering turning. And then he stopped. Because language, which is itself a conditioned thing, cannot capture the unconditioned. Pay attention to this. The Christian mystical tradition, the part of Christianity that goes deepest into the nature of God, uses almost identical language. The medieval theologian Meister Eckhart said that God is beyond all names, beyond all categories, beyond all the concepts the human mind can form. Thomas Aquinas, whose 5 ways are the most famous philosophical arguments for God's existence, said that we cannot know what God is, only what God is not. The Jewish mystical tradition calls this Ein Sof, without end, beyond description, the God who cannot be captured in language. Karen Armstrong, one of the most careful scholars of comparative religion alive, points this out with unusual precision. She argues that the Buddhist silence about God and the Christian mystic's inability to describe God are not opposites. They are two people approaching the same cliff edge from different sides, and discovering that the view from the edge is beyond what either of their languages was built to handle, which raises the question that the Buddhist philosopher and the Christian theologian have been asking each other for 2,000 years. Is nirvana the same reality that Christians call God, experienced differently, approached differently, named differently? Or are they genuinely different things, one personal, one impersonal, one a being, one a state, one who loves, one who simply is? And here is where the paths diverge, not at the cliff edge, but at the question of what you find when you get there. Because for the Christian, what you find is not a state, it is a person, a being who speaks, who calls you by name, who says, I know you, I made you, I love you. Come home. The entire Christian narrative from Genesis to Revelation is the story of a God who pursues, who does not wait at the cliff edge for the seeker to arrive through their own effort, who comes down. The Buddhist path does not have this. It does not need it because the Buddhist diagnosis does not require it. If the problem is craving, the solution is the extinguishing of craving. If the problem is a self that grasps, the solution is the realization of non-self. The path is the practice. The practice is the path. No one is coming to carry you. That is not a failure of Buddhism. It is built into its deepest logic. And C.S. Lewis, writing in a different context, for a different audience, named the thing that sits at the center of this difference. He said, "The longing for something outside conditioned existence is itself evidence that something outside conditioned existence exists. The ache points to the thing that can satisfy it." The Buddhist would agree with the ache. The Buddhist would agree with the pointing. But the Buddhist would say, what you are pointing toward is nirvana, the unconditioned, not a personal God who can be known and loved and prayed to. And the Christian would say, what if it is both? In 1968, a Trappist monk from Kentucky traveled to India. His name was Thomas Merton. He was one of the most widely read Catholic writers of the 20th century, a man who had entered a monastery at 26 and spent the rest of his life going deeper into the contemplative tradition of Christianity. And in the last weeks of his life, he went to Dharamsala to meet the Dalai Lama. They sat together for several hours across 2 meetings. They talked about meditation, about the nature of mind, about what happens when a person goes so far into silence that the ordinary categories of thought dissolve. Merton wrote in his journal that the Dalai Lama was the most impressive religious figure he had ever met, not because he agreed with everything, but because he recognized in him someone who was genuinely, seriously, rigorously pursuing the same thing, by a completely different road. The Dalai Lama said later that of all the Christian teachers he had met, Merton was the one who understood what Buddhism was actually doing, not because Merton was about to become a Buddhist, but because Merton had gone deep enough into his own tradition that he could stand at the edge of it and see, across the distance, someone else standing at the edge of theirs. And now, the silence I promised you at the beginning of this video, the Buddha's silence about God, was not the silence of someone who had considered the question and found it empty. It was the silence of a physician who looked at a dying patient and decided that the most loving thing he could do was not answer the metaphysical question, but remove the arrow. That silence has been misread for 2,000 years, by people who call it atheism, by people who call it agnosticism, by people who say Buddhism is just philosophy dressed up as religion. None of those readings are quite right. The Buddha set the question aside because he had a more urgent one. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that Merton and the Dalai Lama discovered in that room in Dharamsala, is that the Christian tradition, at its deepest, is also trying to answer the same urgent question. Why do we suffer? And how do we get free? Christianity answers, you cannot get free by yourself. That is the whole point. Agape, the unconditional love that does not depend on the worthiness of the recipient, comes from outside you, toward you, before you have done anything to deserve it. The arrow is removed not by your practice but by someone who took it into himself. Buddhism answers, you can get free, but you have to do the work. No one is coming to carry you. The path is available. The path is clear. The path has been walked. Walk it. 2 diagnoses, 2 prescriptions, 1 wound. The real question, the one that Merton was circling in that room, the one that has kept this conversation going for 2,000 years, is not which tradition is right. It is which diagnosis matches what you actually find when you look honestly at yourself. Are you someone who needs a path clear, demanding, requiring everything you have? Or are you someone who has already tried the path and found that the thing blocking you is not effort but grace? Or, and this is the possibility that neither tradition finds easy to sit with both. Before I give you the 3 things I want you to carry out of this video, if this has opened something for you, subscribe and share it with someone who has ever been curious about Buddhism, or about Christianity, or about both, because this conversation deserves more room than it usually gets. 3 things. First, Buddhism does not reject God out of ignorance or superficiality. The Buddha was one of the most rigorous thinkers in human history. His silence on God was a deliberate, considered surgical choice, made because he believed the question of God's existence was not the most urgent question for a person dying from a poisoned arrow. That silence deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed. Second, the deepest difference between Buddhism and Christianity is not about God. It is about who removes the arrow. Buddhism says you do through practice, through the extinguishing of craving, through the gradual realization of what you actually are. Christianity says you cannot, and that the inability is not a failure but an invitation. Grace is not the reward for effort. It is the answer to the end of effort. Both traditions take human suffering with absolute seriousness. They simply disagree about what the solution requires from you. Third, and this is the one I want you to sit with longest, Thomas Merton and the Dalai Lama sat together in a room in India in 1968, 3 weeks before Merton's accidental death, and found that the further each had gone into his own tradition, the closer they had come to each other. Not because the traditions are the same, but because the deepest questions of both, why do we suffer? How do we get free? What is the thing that waits at the end of the path? Are questions that neither tradition can fully answer in words. And that wordlessness, that edge where language runs out, is the place where the real conversation begins. Has this video changed the way you think about Buddhism or about your own faith? Tell me below. I read every single one. The Buddha removed the question of God to make room for the question that mattered most. Jesus answered both at the same time. The conversation between those two responses has been going on for 2,000 years, and it is not finished yet.